Okay. Today, my guest is Professor Allan Bird. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Allan as a person. Professor Bird is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally is a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Allan Bird is a senior professor at the Goa Institute of Management in India. His research interests are global leadership assessment and development, intercultural management, managing in global organizations, international human resource management, and Japanese business and management. He has written over 60 journal articles, 8 books, 37 book chapters, 3 cases, 20 book reviews, technical reports, and business periodicals. Allan received the 2015 Emerald Literati Award for his scholarly contributions, 2013 Outstanding Leadership Book Award, and several Best Paper or Best Symposium Awards at AIB, Global Leadership Advancement Center, and AOM. His Bridging Culture software also received the gold medal in the International Interactive Multimedia Competition. He has served as a track chair, conference chair, program chair, and chair of the Careers Division at AOM, and Association of Japanese Business Studies annual meetings. So thank you, Allan, for making time for us.
Thank you for having me.
Perfect. First question, what did you want to become when you were a child?
You know, that was, I was reflecting on that. I had wanted to become an astronaut when I was very young, but of course that idea was ill-formed and mostly a reflection of the NASA space program. As I got older, I knew that I was fascinated by ideas and words, and I thought I might move in the direction of becoming a lawyer. But ultimately, I found a scholarly life, an interest in ideas and exploring them to be far more rewarding.
And where did you grow up?
Pardon me?
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Stockton, California, a very multicultural town. It's located in the Central Valley of California, a very fertile farmland area, close, about an hour from San Francisco. And in my community growing up, there were at least 60 identifiable ethnic communities. On my street alone, which I would characterize as a typical middle-class neighborhood, my best friends were Italian and Mexican and German. And so early on, and I left out someone who became my closest friend, who was Japanese American. So from an very early age, I was accustomed to understanding that people came from very different backgrounds, had very different perspectives on life. I can remember going with my Italian friend out in the countryside, a family gathering with his extended family, and getting a real appreciation that at an age that I couldn't appreciate at the time, but a real appreciation for Italian cooking and for kind of the Italian family. My Japanese friend, I learned that that taking off shoes in the house and putting on slippers and being very, I would say, very respectful to parents and very orderly in one's life were pretty different from my growing up. Not that I was sloppy or disrespectful to my parents, but it introduced me to a different standard. And so I was always interested in those kind of differences and enjoyed learning about, I would say, the background of people, kind of where they were coming from and how they've been shaped.
Perfect. So what was the journey like from that early years to academia? How did you get to academia?
So I without going into too much detail, I graduated from college, and then a series of unfortunate events and bad advice put me in an interesting place. The unfortunate event was I had applied to a number of schools, but also to the Coast Guard Academy. And which was really my first hope. My grandfather had been in the Coast Guard, and I hoped to follow, but I did not make the cut. I had bad eyesight, and that led to I'll say a downgrading of my application. I wound up on a waiting list instead of being admitted. My backup schools, I thought, were in good order, and then discovered that I'd received bad advice from a high school counselor, and the test scores that had been submitted were not what those schools wanted. And so there I was, just missing my target school and stuck. And I ended up going to a community college, and that really turned out for 2 years, and that actually turned out to be an extraordinary education. I learned from some phenomenal professors in studying general subjects, and got a chance to learn things in a way different. One of my best friends had wound up at UC Berkeley, and we both took a philosophy course, and it turned out we were using the same textbook. And when we got together during the Christmas break, I discovered that I knew a lot more than he did. He had sat in a lecture hall with 400 other students listening to a professor, lecture that way. I had been in a small class of 20 students with a professor who was trained at one of the best universities in the country for philosophy. That would be the University of Southern California. And he was teaching at a community college because he had come to academia late in life. And so the typical doors that would be open to a newly minted PhD weren't open to him. And so through that series of events and teachers, I really developed a great interest. At one point, I stepped away from school for 2 years to serve a mission for my church, wholly voluntary, and we don't have a choice when we make that decision. We go where we're sent. I was sent to Japan, and that 2 years in Japan completely opened my eyes to a different world. I felt completely at home in Japan. At the same time, it was so foreign to anything I had known, and I really puzzled over that for quite a few years. How could I feel so comfortable in a place that seemed so foreign? And that then led to an opportunity to do my graduate work in Japan. I returned to the US, was influenced by a history professor who, unbeknownst to me, kind of charted my course for me. He really thought I should go an academic route, line things up. And when I graduated with my undergraduate degree, he had put me in a position to pursue a master's degree in Japan. And so off I went. And then that naturally led to an academic career over time. At one point, after I had my degree and had been working in Japan for several years, we made a decision, my wife and I, to move back to the States. I applied for a job with the State Department and received a job offer. I applied for a job with an electronics trading company and had a job offer. And on the advice of someone I met along the way, Jim Clausen at the University of Virginia, I had an extraordinary conversation with him one evening while I was traveling. And I thought, well, I might as well, as long as I'm pursuing these other opportunities, I might as well consider pursuing an academic career as well. That's kind of had been in the back of my mind. And I was accepted to the PhD program at the University of Oregon. And so there I sat with 3 different paths in front of me. And I thought, I can always go into the private sector. I can always go work for the government. But I don't know that I'll have many opportunities to pursue an academic career, and I haven't looked back. It was unquestionably the right path for me.
Fascinating. Thank you. So, something that is not on your CV that people might find interesting about you.
I don't know. My avatar name on many social platforms is Mr. Generic. I'm not sure that there's anything particularly interesting about me. I would say that I enjoy the outdoors. I used to hike and do a lot of and do camping a lot, and then as I got older and my knees went out, I switched to kayaking. And if there's water nearby, I'm inclined to find a boat and go that direction. So I'll say that about me. Beyond that, I'm curious about people. I enjoy going different places and learning about people.
And how did you end up in India?
Oh, that's another long story. I have a friend who's convinced I should write a book, an autobiography. But I just I've got other things I want to do before I spend time talking about myself. I was in a chaired position at Northeastern University, and I felt like I had accomplished the things I had wanted to accomplish there. And I decided I would take on a new challenge and also move back to the West Coast. And so I accepted a position in administration, as Vice President of International Affairs at a small liberal arts college. And when I did that, it was right when COVID struck. And I had gone out on a contract, gave up tenure and had gone out on a contract which I thought would be sufficient. And when COVID struck, the school decided to back away from all of the international initiatives they had going on. Mm-hmm. And they elected to buy out my contract. So I was in a somewhat comfortable position. I had an income, but no work. And because we had lived, my wife and family, we had lived overseas in Japan for about 5 years. Early in my career, I thought I could use another challenge. I should use this opportunity while I'm relatively free to seek new learning opportunities, to see if I actually do understand anything about how to work with people who are different. And so I looked around, and Goa had some interesting things going. Again, this was in the midst of the pandemic, but they were willing to experiment with me, and I thought I'm willing to come to India. If you're looking for diversity, this is a good location to find it. There's a saying that whatever true thing you can say about India, the opposite is also true, which means there's unending opportunities to encounter things you can't easily anticipate and to make sense of them. And it has been an adventure.
Perfect. So I normally ask about the second path. If you can do it all over again, what would be the second best career path for you? What would you do?
It's an interesting question, because I had a possible career in front of me when I graduated with my undergraduate degree. In order to take care of myself and to kind of pay my own way through college, I had started working in restaurants, working my way up from a busboy to a prep chef, kind of understudying with people. And at the time I was finishing up the last year and a half of my studies, I was at Fresno State University. I had come on board to a restaurant, and through a series of departures and turnover, I wound up in the position of head chef for that particular restaurant. And I could easily, I loved to cook. I loved spending time in the kitchen. I loved doing things with a restaurant group. It's an big restaurants are an interesting organization. And with a high level of interpersonal interaction. And I could see myself having achieved that position of staying with that. I've often thought, if I can't teach, I can always work in a kitchen. I know my way around a kitchen. I haven't had that opportunity, although I do enjoy cooking for large groups on occasion.
After you retire, or if you retire, would you open up a restaurant?
For many years, I thought about opening a small restaurant. I'm fascinated by sandwiches and the wide variety of sandwiches. You can't travel around the world like I have without encountering kind of every variety of sandwich. And when I say sandwich, I'm not, I'm thinking very very broadly of anything, anything on a piece of bread, and I define bread very broadly, anything that's, so that could be a flatbread, it could be pita, it could be, sourdough is my favorite bread of choice, but and then the things you do on that, whether you do it open face like you find in Scandinavia, whether you pile meat high, or all of the different things. There are so many different ways you can go with a sandwich. And I thought that I could have a shop small enough, but to have enough variety to do that. At this point, I don't see myself. That sounds like too much work. Would I go work in somebody else's sandwich shop if they were making gourmet sandwiches with wide variety? You might find me in the kitchen there.
Yes. Regrets. Have you got any regrets?
Pardon me. There was a little.
Do you have
static
any
on my
regrets? Is there one thing you wish you would have done or done differently?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate in my career to be at some fine schools, work with some fine colleagues, and on occasion I've been approached to to see if I was willing to move to another institution, and my response had always been, I'm happy where I'm at, but I'm willing to listen. I like an adventure. At one point in my career, I just accepted a chaired position at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And I was only 2 months into the job, and I just moved the family across country. And an inquiry came from a business school in one of the European business schools that had opened a branch campus in Singapore, and that sounded exciting, and it was a one time I did not say I'm happy where I'm at, but I'm willing to listen. I just said, oh, I just moved, not now, and I've always regretted not at least listening to what that opportunity may have looked like. I don't know that I would have taken it. We had just, moving as a significant effort, and takes a lot of work, and I don't know that I would have been up for another move. But I regret not at least exploring the option. So it's not a big regret in the grand scheme of things in my career. It's not something I worry over, but it's the one time when I didn't at least listen to what might be possible.
Yeah, but it would make a huge difference. You know, living in Singapore versus living in India, then the trajectories are different from Singapore versus India. It's a huge decision note, right?
Yeah.
What are you most proud of?
I work hard not to nurture pride, and so that's a question I struggle with, because I would say I'm not proud of anything, but I'm pleased with many things, and so if I could rephrase that to what am I most pleased about. I think I would say it has been my ability to make contributions both in my research and also institutionally to help people work more effectively with one another. In my research, if there's a theme that you can find in my research, it's all about how do people who are different from one another work together effectively. Over the last 20 years or so, I've been focused on global leadership, but I really see that as the challenge of how do you lead people who are different, and how do you do that effectively. In building institutions, in setting up programs, and designing curriculum and the like, my focus again has been the same thing. If I can wax a bit more philosophical, there is a lot of pain in the world, and there's a lot of conflict, and so much of it, from where I sit, seems needless, seems disappointing that it would exist. And so my interest has been trying to understand how do we help managers, how do we help employees, how do we help leaders, how do we help people in our community work across those differences.
I see. So let's just talk about research a bit. How do you explain your research and importance of your research? Why you do what you do? To laymen, to people who don't read scholarly journals.
That is interesting. If I can just preface my response with this. When I was early in my career, I was driving cross country, and I stopped in to visit one of my brothers. I have 6 siblings, and he asked me what I was doing, and I'd only been a professor for a couple of years, and I started to give a long-winded answer, and he looked at me and he said, "Allan, you don't understand the 3-second rule. If you can't tell people what you do in 3 seconds, what you do is unimportant." And for the rest of that trip, which had 4 or 5 weeks left on it, I would be driving across country and reflecting on, well, how do I sum that up? You know, how do I say in 3 seconds? Or is the work I'm doing really not very important? And I would say, as I indicated earlier, I try to understand how to help people who are different work effectively with one another. I don't know if that quite hits the 3-second mark.
Yeah, it does. I was counting that.
About as simple as I can get. If I were sitting in a pub somewhere and somebody said, you know, "What do you do, Mr. Academic?" I'd say, well, I try to help people figure out how to get along with one another. You know, a particular venue of organizations and in a context of international, but I think the things I'm working on make just as much sense if we're talking about how do we get marketers and engineers to work effectively with one another. Those are differences that often get in the way of smooth relationships as well.
True. Things that we have omitted in research in IB, things that we have underutilized, underdeveloped, understudied. overlooked?
I just I just gave a keynote address at the AIB Oceania gathering last week, and what I spoke about there was context matters, and I think in IB we have been talking about context for a long time. In fact, some, and including some of the founding fathers of the field, have argued that ultimately what international business is about is context and understanding context. But I think we've gotten away from that understanding, and we've tended to think in terms of context as being something that qualitative researchers study. You know, they're those qualitative people who go in and do ethnographic studies, you know, and archival research, and they do contextual research. But really, what we all do is contextual research, except we don't always acknowledge it. And because we don't acknowledge it, I think we don't do it as well as we should. And I'll give you a quick example of that. As reviewing editor at JIBS currently, I see a lot of manuscripts that come in that talk about emerging markets. We're looking at entrepreneurship in emerging markets, or we're looking at multinational firms that that originate in emerging markets. And I'm trying to understand what emerging markets are. When I look at the definitions of emerging markets, the ones used by like the World Bank, for example, they have specific definitions that are, I would say, primarily financial, some sociological indices. But you wind up with a list of countries, and it's 20 or 21 because of the methodology they employ, that include China, Israel, Thailand. I'm trying to figure out what makes those three so similar that we would put them in a category called emerging markets. And the other question I have is that the notion of emerging markets appeared over 20 years ago. At what point do we stop talking about countries as emerging market countries? China has the second largest economy in the world. Hasn't it stopped emerging? Isn't there a better way to understand the context of business in China, or Chinese businesses' interactions in a global economy, other than with the label of emerging? That I don't find that helpful, and I think it actually clouds the problem. India, I'm here in India, and by different measures, India is either the 7th largest economy or the 4th largest economy in the world. Now, that's not to say it's a fully developed economy, that it's on a par in terms of level of development with the OECD countries, but I don't think emerging is a very helpful term, and I don't think a category called emerging is helpful. So if we're going to talk about context, then I think we need to be much more specific and much more sophisticated. Otherwise, we're really not explaining anything. And that's a big fear that I have with regard to where we're at in IB. If any discipline, excuse me, if any discipline should be sensitive to and sophisticated about in talking about context, it ought to be international business. That should be our bread and butter. Sure. We should be able to, preach loudly to other disciplines. This is how you look at context. At that same Oceania gathering, Bo Nielsen did a great workshop on multi-level theorizing and analysis. And I think of that as part of how do we better understand the context, that the things that happen at the organizational level are influenced by individual level phenomena and actors, and also industry level or country level actors. And yet most of the models we work with in international business well, I won't say most of the models, I'll say quite a lot of the research that we see in international business doesn't really address those different levels, which again are part of the context that we need to understand what's going on.
Mhm. True. Now I'm going to jump ahead and then come back to a couple more functional questions. You started with the forefathers of the field and then the progress moving away from contextualization. And why is that? What is this evolution or the shift in the culture, IB culture? What do you attribute it to, and where are we headed to?
Well, let me zero in and focus on one area which I think can help explain the broader context. But most of my work around leadership and interpersonal, intercultural interactions is really focused in what I'll call the cultural context, and the driving influence there has been Hofstede and culture's consequences from 1980 forward to at least through, I would say, 2010. That approach, those sets of values, and really that way of thinking about culture really dominated all of the research that's going on. And in many respects, I can remember when Hofstede came out. I was in Japan at the time working in a research center, and boy, the impact that book had was extraordinary. Immediately, people started talking about things differently, looking at things differently. I would say, unfortunately, though, I think it set a lot of research on a particular trajectory that was confined to looking at culture in only the way that Hofstede looks at it. Business people who talk about and study culture drive anthropologists up the wall, because in anthropology, there are myriad different approaches to defining what culture is and how to think about it. Is it a communication system? Is it a control system? There are lots of different approaches, and how should we understand it? And so the notion that, we could quickly understand a culture by identifying 5 or 6 values, and there you don't need Hofstede. You can take Trompenaars and Hamden Turner. You can take Shalom Schwartz's work. And this is not a criticism of their work, but it represents just a single strain. I think more broadly, a similar phenomena happened where we kind of locked into some particular ways of thinking about international business and the way to study it. And we kind of lock into that, and we stay that way. I think more recently, a number of things have happened. One, the environment has gotten significantly more complex. And this is not just, we didn't notice how complex it was before. No, it's gotten more complex. The level of interdependence among economies. If you look modern supply chain operations for major corporations, they are orders of magnitude more complex than they were 30 years ago. And so you've got that I'd say tightly linked interdependence. And then the variety you find, the variety in markets, the varieties in business models. We have new business models that didn't exist before. And then the pace of change is so dramatic and difficult to forecast. So when you throw those things together, the world's gotten a lot more complex, and we have had to struggle to make sense of that. And some of that is, I think, actually pushed us to go back to, let's pay attention to the context. If you think about it in a medical sense, we used to prescribe, in the United States, we had pharmaceutical companies, and they would come out with new medications, and everybody would take, those who were affected would take the medications. And then if you've been paying attention, you realize that new medicines come forward, and not only do they, are they to treat a particular not symptom, but ailment, a disease, they come with a lengthy list, sometimes 3 or 4 pages long of all of the potential side effects. You may experience this, you may experience that. And what's going on there? Well, what's going on is we have a more sophisticated understanding of the human body. And we recognize through our research on DNA that generalized ways of thinking about how to treat people are problematic. And in the same way, generalized ways of thinking about organizations, what they do. So we've had to become more sophisticated in how we think about things. And that, I would say, is reflected in the sorts of methodologies you see now. There's been an explosion in both qualitative and quantitative methodologies. And we've become much more sensitive. In IB, one of the ongoing, endogeneity has always been an issue in international business. We now have tools that allow us to understand and to examine, potential endogeneity issues in a way that we didn't before. But that increases the complexity of our research. If we have to, if we're having to attend to all of those things, it's reflected in JIBs moving away from, significant level p-values reporting, 0.05, 0.10, 0.001, and the like. Now we require at JIBs that you just report actual p-values. And why is that? Because the p-values could be deceptive. And what's more important is actually understanding the actual effect size, which you can understand better if we can look at the actual p-values and not be fooled into thinking, okay, that's a 1 asterisk or a 2 asterisk, effect, because there are lots of things that can generate that 1 or 2 asterisk effect that may not actually tell us much about what the nature of the relationship is between those variables.
Thank you. This was very good. Let's talk about some advice portion of the interview. What was the best advice you received along the way for a successful career?
There are a couple of pieces of advice that stand out. When I was just accepted into a doctoral program, I had an opportunity to have a conversation with someone who had just exited a doctoral program. He was in finance and halfway across the country, but he told me, he said, it may be tempting to treat a doctoral program like school. It's not, it's a job, it's full-time. If you will treat it like a job, if you will, and I asked him, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, put in at least 40 hours a week, you'll be fine. If you just think, well, I have a class scheduled at this time, or I need to prepare for that exam, he said, you're never going to be where you need to be. But if you'll treat it like a job, and I think my wife will tell you, I've been treating it like a job ever since. I usually get my 40 hours of work in, frequently much more. So for early people, early career, doctoral students and like, I would say this is a job. The sooner you start approaching it as a job, as opposed to, it'll be a job once I graduate. With regard to, kind of once you're in the profession, there's numerous pieces of advice, but the one that has stuck with me wasn't given as a form of advice, it was given as a form of admonition. At one point, I think I'd been out 4 or 5 years. I was still an assistant professor. I was at NYU, and I talked to a senior scholar. I visited up at Columbia for a year at that time, and up at Columbia, I had a conversation with Hugh Patrick, and wonderful economist, and runs the Japan Center up there. And he said something to me. We were talking about research, and of course, my research is not economics, but he was looking at it from a career perspective. And he said, "You need to cultivate the craft of scholarship." Well, I thought I was working to publish papers and to teach classes and the like, and I actually felt uncomfortable when he suggested that I was a scholar. It was like, no, I'm not a scholar. That's somebody much further along in their career. And that's when he said, you have to cultivate the craft of scholarship. You are a scholar. I think the sooner, particularly early career researchers, the sooner they begin to view themselves as scholar, albeit, distant from where they hope to be or where they aspire to be. But as soon as you kind of take on that mantle of scholarship, I think that changes how you approach your research. Pressures to publish, pressures to do research or to teach classes don't necessarily become any easier, but I think the way you approach them changes. And I think it changes in a way. We are in such an unusual profession.
But look, Allan,
things are,
earlier on, when we talked about pride and what were you proud of, and then you had a great answer, and then here you're talking about as a junior faculty, as a junior scholar, whether you can consider yourself a scholar or not. There is the underlying theme here. Aristotle, he gives the example of a person hiding a light under a bushel, right? There's much to think about that little instance. It's not even an example, it's just an instance of some sort of an image that a person is hiding a light under a bushel. And that is not something desirable in the field. Actually, if you think about it, it's not about modesty, it's not about humility, it's something else here. It's yes, the junior faculty might not feel they are accomplishing, but at one point, everyone needs to own their accomplishments. And once you own them, it actually starts building, right? So what's your advice to junior faculty going forward for a successful career? Your advice.
I appreciate the perspective you've shared there. Because I think if you say you're a scholar, that doesn't mean you have the answers. It means I think it means you approach the work that you do with a certain measure of humility, but also a certain mantle of responsibility. Sure. that you have to manage this properly. You have to be careful what you say, but you also have to say it. Sure. If you don't say it, then you're not doing it. And my advice to senior scholars would be to give a hand to those behind. I've done a lot of hiking in my life, and some places on the trail, they're a lot easier to navigate if the person ahead of you on the trail kind of reaches back and gives you a handhold or braces your backpack and allows you to get your position. I think it's easy. Well, I don't want to say it's easy. I've observed people later in their careers kind of become absorbed in their careers, and yet there's so much that they have to share. One of the reasons I came to India and the Goa Institute is I thought, okay, India is a country on the rise. There are lots of business schools, but I have some experience. I have some perspective that I think might help, and this is not a boastful, hey, look at me, or, pay attention to me, but it's rather, I've seen some things and I know some things. I have some ideas. I've been reasonably successful in publishing. So maybe there's some things I could help, junior scholars with. Maybe I can, provide counsel. And I would say I find that particularly rewarding. In some cases, more rewarding than publishing another paper on, myself. It's to see a young scholar kind of, realize that, hey, I can do this, and I understand, and now I see, how this is done, and I'm comfortable. I'm confident that I can pursue it. I think that it, at least for me, is tremendously rewarding. And my advice to other senior scholars would be to, give a hand to those behind, help them up the path.
Thank you. Allan, last question. What's the question I should have asked you but haven't?
Pardon me?
What's the question I should have asked you but haven't?
The question you should have asked, and I had been thinking about that very question. The question you should have asked is, what keeps me up at night? What do I worry about?
Well, here you go.
And now you want me to answer that question. Well, right now, most of my attention is focused on my editorial responsibility at JIBS. And as reviewing editor, I, along with my co-editor, Shared Bugelsdijk, make decisions about which manuscripts will go forward into the review process and which manuscripts will be desk rejected. And we desk reject about 2/3. I think our numbers are running somewhere around 64%. And what keeps me up at night, what I worry most about, are type 1 and type 2 errors. I worry sometimes when there are manuscripts that I rejected 3 months ago, that there are a couple that still kind of rattle around in my mind, and I wonder, did I do the right thing? Did I reject a manuscript that had tremendous potential and could have made a significant contribution? But I also worry about the other type of error. Have I forwarded a manuscript and taken up the valuable time of the area editor and the reviewers on a manuscript that really, did not have potential? The manuscripts that come in and are kind of really, really well done and stand out, those are easy. And the ones that come in and, are not well done or don't fit the journal, those are easy. But there are always a handful that sit right kind of on the border. And those are the ones, as I say, some of those just kind of stay with me. And I wonder, at JIBS, you can, when we desk reject a manuscript, we usually include a note that should the authors wish to respond to our criticisms and resubmit, they're welcome to. So I hold out hope that, and on occasion they do, that authors who feel like we may have missed something will come back. So I don't lose too much sleep over that. And on the other side, I'm confident that area editors, if I've sent something through that shouldn't go forward, they too can desk reject. And so that makes my sleep a bit less fitful than it would be without those safety mechanisms. But I love to read good papers. They just announced last week the Decade Award for the paper published in 2013. I don't know about others. It was not my research, but I was excited for the authors, and I had thought that was a great paper when I read it, back then.
Thank you so much, Allan, for your time, for your thoughts. I enjoyed this interview. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thank you.
You're welcome.